Justice, same length. In the remote hills of eastern Oregon, buried beneath layers of official silence that have lasted for generations, rests a truth so deeply unsettling that local authorities chose to suppress it for more than 100 years. Between 1852 and 1888, over 800 pioneers simply disappeared along a 20-mile corridor of the Oregon Trail, not claimed by disease, not lost to tragic accidents, but consumed by something far more malevolent. The Sacred Heart Chapel, a humble wooden sanctuary that appeared to offer dying travelers their last hope of salvation, was in truth the nerve center of the most meticulously orchestrated mass murder conspiracy in the history of the American frontier. What began as scattered, unexplainable vanishings evolved into a family dynasty of death, so calculated, so brutally efficient, that it forever redefined our understanding of human depravity. The Grayson family did not merely kill for material gain. They elevated murder to a dark craft, maintaining precise documentation of every soul they extinguished, every bloodline they annihilated, every aspiration they interred in unmarked earth, before we descend into the abyss that ultimately consumed both the Graysons and their countless victims. I must ask something of you. This channel does not cater to everyone, only to those possessing the fortitude to face the most unsettling truths concealed within America's heritage. If you count yourself among those capable of bearing these grim revelations, subscribe now and share in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support enables us to unearth the narratives that others lack the courage to tell. Now, let us travel back to 1852, when the Oregon Trail promised prosperity, but delivered only horror. The Oregon Trail stretched like a vital artery across the untamed American frontier, carrying the aspirations of thousands westward through zallows and miles of merciless wilderness. For the countless families who liquidated everything they possessed for a chance at renewal, each mile embodied both hope and mortal danger. Disease, starvation, and natural catastrophes claimed innumerable lives. Yet in the undulating hills of eastern Oregon, death manifested in an altogether different form, one that smiled with Christian compassion, while coldly calculating the worth of a family's earthly treasures. The year 1852 represented the zenith of Oregon Trail migration, with more than 50 zallows and souls undertaking the perilous journey west. By the time most wagon trains reached Oregon's Blue Mountains, they had already traversed nearly 800 miles. Families were depleted, provisions were running dangerously low, and the most vulnerable members were frequently succumbing to trail fever, dysentery, and various ailments that transformed dreams of prosperity into desperate battles for mere survival. It was within this landscape of profound vulnerability that Father Moriah Grayson established the Sacred Heart Chapel in 1851. The weathered timber structure occupied a hill overlooking a natural resting point along the trail, a place where exhausted travelers frequently paused to refresh their oxen and lay their dead to rest. To passing pioneers, the chapel embodied divine providence, a beacon of hope rising from the wilderness where they might find spiritual solace, and, if necessary, proper Christian burial for those they'd lost. Father Moriah, a tall, gaunt figure in his 40s, possessing penetrating gray eyes and a voice that naturally commanded attention, had arrived in Oregon territory, presenting himself as an itinerant missionary. He spoke with eloquence about his divine calling to minister to the spiritual needs of westward bound families, and his command of Scripture appeared genuine enough to persuade even the most wary travelers. At his side stood his devoted wife, who had adopted the name Sister Constance, a woman whose gentle demeanor and apparent healing abilities made her indispensable to families struggling with ailing children and dying relatives. Brother Ezekiel, Moriah's younger sibling, completed the trio that would become synonymous with both deliverance and damnation. Where Morai possessed the commanding presence of a born leader, Ezekiel served as the pragmatic one. Skilled with his hands, knowledgeable about livestock, and perpetually willing to assist struggling families with wagon repairs or animal care. Together, the three constructed an image of Christian benevolence that drew desperate families like moths to a consuming flame. The chapel itself was modest yet well kept, constructed from local timber with a small cemetery adjacent to the main structure. Inside, rough, hewn pews faced a simple altar adorned with a wooden cross that Morai claimed to have carved personally. The building's most distinctive feature was its unusually expansive basement, which the Graysons explained as necessary storage for supplies maintained to assist impoverished travelers. The surrounding community was sparse. A few scattered homesteads and a small trading post approximately 15 miles to the east. This isolation served the Graysons exceptionally well, providing fewer witnesses to their activities and reduced likelihood of outside interference. Local settlers who had encountered the family generally spoke favorably of them, praising their generosity and Christian devotion. After all, who else would dedicate their existence to ministering to dying strangers in such a remote location? What rendered the Graysons particularly effective was their profound understanding of the trail's brutal realities. They recognized that by the time families reached their location, many would be confronting serious illness, critically low supplies, and the psychological exhaustion resulting from months of hardship. They positioned themselves as the solution to these problems. Not merely spiritual guides, but practical helpers capable of providing medical attention, provisions, and even temporary shelter for families too weakened to continue immediately. The question of denominational affiliation never seemed significant to desperate families. Whether Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, or any other Protestant faith, the Graysons adapted their approach accordingly. Morai was thoroughly versed in various Protestant traditions and could quote scripture in whatever manner best comforted his audience. This adaptability proved crucial on the frontier, where denominational distinctions frequently became secondary to simple survival. The first documented disappearance occurred on September 23, 1852, though investigators would not piece together the timeline until decades later. The Morrison family, James, his pregnant wife Elizabeth, their 3 young children, and Elizabeth's elderly father, had been traveling with a wagon train that dispersed upon reaching Oregon territory. Like numerous families, they decided to press on alone toward their destination, confident they could cover the remaining distance without larger group protection. When the Morrisons' wagon suffered a broken axle just 2 miles from the Sacred Heart Chapel, it appeared providential. James Morrison would later be quoted in territorial records as saying the chapel materialized like a gift from the Almighty when he spotted it from the ridge where his wagon had broken down. Brother Ezekiel, who seemed to possess an uncanny ability to appear precisely when travelers most needed assistance, arrived at the broken wagon within hours of the accident. Brother, Ezekiel said in the measured cadence that would become his trademark, "The Lord has placed you near our humble chapel for a purpose. Sister Constance has delivered many babies, and your Elizabeth appears ready to give birth any day. Father Morai would consider it an honor to provide sanctuary while you repair your wagon and prepare for this blessed arrival." The Morrison family gratefully accepted the invitation, moving into the small cabin adjacent to the chapel that the Graysons maintained for precisely such purposes. For 3 days, everything appeared entirely normal. Sister Constance attended to Elizabeth with gentle care. Brother Ezekiel assisted James with wagon repairs, Father Morai provided spiritual comfort to the anxious family. The children played in the chapel yard while Elizabeth's father, Samuel, rested his arthritic bones in the cabin's comfortable rocking chair. On the fourth day, circumstances began to shift. Elizabeth's father became the first to fall ill, complaining of severe stomach cramps and nausea. Sister Constance attributed this to trail sickness, a catch-all term for various ailments afflicting travelers, and began administering what she called blessed remedies, prepared from herbs and other ingredients kept in the chapel's basement. The Lord provides healing through nature's abundance, she would say while mixing her concoctions. But sometimes the body must purge itself of toxins before healing can commence. Within hours of consuming Sister Constance's medicine, Samuel's condition deteriorated dramatically. His skin acquired a grayish pallor. His breathing became labored. He began experiencing violent episodes of vomiting and diarrhea. James Morrison, growing alarmed, asked whether they should seek help from the trading post to the east. But Father Morai counseled patience. "Brother James," the preacher said, placing a reassuring hand on the younger man's shoulder, "I have witnessed this sickness many times on the trail. It must run its course. Moving Samuel now would surely kill him. We must trust in the Lord's timing and Sister Constance's healing gifts." By the sixth day, young Tommy Morrison, age 7, began displaying similar symptoms, followed by his sister Mary, age 5. Sister Constance worked tirelessly, preparing more remedies, administering what she called purifying treatments, and maintaining vigil over the increasingly sick family members. To James and Elizabeth, still healthy but exhausted from caring for their loved ones, the woman appeared as a saint sent by God to guide them through their ordeal. The truth was far more sinister. The blessed remedies that Sister Constance administered with such apparent devotion contained carefully measured arsenic doses, which the Graysons had discovered could be obtained from local mining operations under the pretext of pest control. The symptoms: stomach cramps, nausea, skin discoloration, and eventual organ failure, perfectly mimicked various trail diseases, rendering the murders virtually undetectable to grieving family members who had already witnessed so much death during their westward journey. Samuel Morrison died on the 7th day, followed by Tommy on the 9th and Mary on the 11th. Each death was accompanied by elaborate Christian rituals, performed by Father Morai, who spoke movingly about the deceased joining their Heavenly Father and finding peace after earthly suffering. The remaining family members, devastated by grief, yet grateful for the Graysons' spiritual support, never questioned the rapid succession of deaths. After all, entire families had been known to succumb to disease on the trail. What they didn't know was that each night, after the grieving survivors had exhausted themselves with weeping and prayer, Brother Ezekiel systematically searched through the family's possessions, making detailed inventories of everything valuable. The Morrisons had been relatively prosperous in Missouri, and their wagon contained fine furniture, quality tools, family heirlooms, and a substantial quantity of gold coins that James had sewn into hidden clothing pockets. On the 12th day, James Morrison himself began experiencing the telltale symptoms. Elizabeth, now in early labor and terrified, she would lose her husband along with her children and father, begged Sister Constance to do everything possible to save him. The woman's response would later be remembered as particularly chilling by those who eventually uncovered the truth. "My dear child," Sister Constance said, holding Elizabeth's trembling hands, "some illnesses are God's method of calling his children home. We must not question his wisdom, only trust in his mercy. Your husband will join your precious babies in paradise, and you will raise your new child, knowing that your family awaits you in glory. James Morrison died on the 14th day, just hours before Elizabeth gave birth to a son who would live only long enough to be baptized by Father Morai. When Elizabeth herself succumbed to the same mysterious illness 3 days later, the entire Morrison family had been wiped out in less than 3 weeks. To any outside observer who might have inquired about the family's fate, the Graysons had a perfectly reasonable explanation. The Morrisons had arrived sick and exhausted from the trail, contracted a virulent form of dysentery that sometimes struck entire families, and died despite the best efforts of Christian caregivers who had risked their own lives to provide comfort in their final hours. Father Morai had given them proper Christian burial in the chapel cemetery, and their possessions had been consecrated to the Lord's work, a euphemism for theft that sounded appropriately pious. But the Morrison family's disappearance was merely the beginning. The Graysons had discovered something that would transform their lives and terrorize the Oregon Trail for the next 36 years. Murder, when executed with sufficient planning and religious justification, could be extraordinarily profitable. The success of their first family annihilation taught the Graysons valuable lessons that would shape their methodology for decades. They learned that isolated families were easier targets than those traveling in groups, that the gradual onset of arsenic poisoning perfectly mimicked common trail ailments, and that their religious authority granted them almost unlimited credibility with desperate, grieving people who needed someone to blame besides God for their suffering. Most importantly, they discovered that the Oregon Trail provided them with an endless supply of victims who wouldn't be missed for months, if ever. Unlike settled communities where disappearances would be quickly noticed and investigated, the trail was filled with transient families whose exact whereabouts were unknown to relatives back east. A family that vanished in Oregon might not be expected to contact loved ones for 6 months or more. And even then, the dangers of frontier life provided countless plausible explanations for their silence. The months following the Morrison murders saw the Graysons refining their operation. With methodical precision, they established patterns and procedures that would serve them well over the years. Brother Ezekiel became their scout, riding the trail approaches to identify promising targets. Families with obvious wealth, those traveling alone or in small groups, and especially those already dealing with illness or mechanical problems that made them vulnerable to offers of assistance. Sister Constance developed her poisoning techniques, experimenting with different doses and delivery methods to achieve maximum effectiveness. While maintaining plausible deniability, she discovered that arsenic could be easily disguised in herbal teas, medicinal tinctures, and even communion wine, making it simple to administer to entire families under the guise of spiritual or medical care. Father Morai, meanwhile, perfected the psychological manipulation that kept victims compliant even as their loved ones died around them. He became expert at reading people's denominational backgrounds and adjusting his theological approach accordingly. For Methodist families, he emphasized divine healing and the power of prayer. For Presbyterians, he focused on predestination and God's ultimate plan. For Baptists, he stressed personal salvation and the promise of heavenly reunion. The chapel itself underwent subtle modifications to support their murderous enterprise. The basement was expanded and divided into sections, one area for storing victims' possessions, another for preparing arsenic solutions, and a third that served as a temporary morgue, where bodies could be kept while the Graysons decided on disposal methods. They also dug a series of unmarked graves in a grove of trees behind the chapel. locations that would eventually hold the remains of hundreds of their victims. The winter of 1852 to 1853 provided the Graysons with valuable time to plan and prepare for the next year's killing season. They used the months when the trail was largely empty to sort through the Morrison family's possessions, deciding what to keep, what to sell, and what to hide. They also made their first contact with black market dealers in larger Oregon settlements, establishing relationships with men who asked no questions about the origins of the goods they purchased. Brother Ezekiel proved particularly adept at this aspect of their operation. His honest face and straightforward manner made him believable when he claimed to be selling possessions on behalf of families who had decided to return east or had died of natural causes. He learned to space out his sales across multiple communities and to target different types of buyers for different categories of goods. Fine furniture and household items went to wealthy settlers looking to improve their homes. Tools and farming equipment were sold to practical farmers. Jewelry and precious metals found their way to merchants who specialized in such items. By spring 1853, the Graysons had transformed from amateur killers into professional predators with a sophisticated understanding of their craft. They had resolved the practical problems of victim selection, murder methodology, body disposal, and profit realization. More importantly, they had created a public persona that made them virtually above suspicion. The spring of 1853 brought renewed trail traffic and fresh opportunities for the Grayson family enterprise. Their second major success came in May when they encountered the Hoffman family, German immigrants who spoke limited English and were traveling with a wagon full of valuable possessions, including fine craftsmanship tools, quality textiles, and a substantial quantity of gold coins representing their life savings. The Hoffmans were ideal victims in many ways. Their language barrier made them dependent on the Graysons for communication with other travelers. Their foreign customs made them seem exotic and potentially suspicious to other trail users, and their obvious wealth made them attractive targets. Additionally, their limited English meant they were less likely to understand subtle warnings or effectively communicate concerns to other travelers. The family's patriarch, Heinrich Hoffman, was a skilled clockmaker who had brought his tools and trade goods to establish a business in Oregon. His wife, Greta, was pregnant with their fourth child, and their 3 existing children ranged from 6 to 12 years old. When mechanical problems with their wagon forced them to seek help near the Sacred Heart Chapel, the Graysons saw another opportunity to perfect their deadly craft. This time they experimented with different approaches. Instead of waiting for the family to develop natural illness, Sister Constance began administering small arsenic doses almost immediately, disguised as preventive medicine to ward off trail diseases. She convinced the family that the blessed protection she offered would keep them healthy during their recovery period. "My God," Heinrich said in broken English when Sister Constance first offered her medicine. "You are so kind to strangers. God will bless you for helping us. God has already blessed us." Sister Constance replied with practiced sincerity, "By giving us the opportunity to serve His children in their time of need." The Hoffman family's murder took nearly a month to complete, but the extended timeline allowed the Graysons to thoroughly inventory their possessions and establish detailed plans for disposing of the valuable clockmaking tools and trade goods. It also gave them time to study the family's routines and relationships, knowledge that would prove valuable in their future operations. By the end of 1853, the Graysons had successfully murdered 3 complete families totaling 16 people, and they had begun to see their operation as a business requiring the same careful planning and attention to detail as any other profitable enterprise. They started keeping records, not just of their victims' possessions, but of their methods, their mistakes, and their successes. These records, discovered decades later in the chapel's hidden basement compartments, would eventually provide investigators with a horrifying window into the systematic nature of the Grayson family's crimes. Written in Father Morai's precise handwriting, the ledgers contained detailed entries for each family they murdered, including names, dates, possessions taken, disposal methods used, and profits realized from selling stolen goods. The entries were written in a cold, businesslike style that treated human lives as inventory items. A typical entry might read, Morrison family, 5 souls departed, September-October 1852. Possessions included 2 gold coins, furniture items, quality tools. Bodies interred in Grove Section C. Estimated profit, 400. Method arsenic via medicinal teas. Duration 17 days. Lessons learned. Reduce dose frequency to extend timeline and reduce suspicion. As word of the Graysons' charitable work spread along the trail, they began attracting victims, actively seeking their help. Families who had heard about the good Christian folk providing aid to travelers would sometimes seek out the Sacred Heart Chapel specifically. Walking directly into the trap the Graysons had so carefully constructed. The Graysons' methodical approach to mass murder evolved significantly during their second year of operation. They had learned from their early experiences that success required not just effective killing techniques, but also sophisticated systems for managing every aspect of their deadly enterprise. Father Morai, with his analytical mind and leadership skills, began treating their operation like a business that happened to involve murder rather than a series of random killings. The summer of 1854 marked a turning point in their methodology when they encountered the Weatherby family from Tennessee. Charles Weatherby was a former Confederate officer who had decided to seek his fortune in Oregon rather than rebuild his war-torn plantation. He traveled with his wife Margaret, their twin daughters Sarah and Susan C. aged 15, and Margaret's younger brother David, a skilled blacksmith who had brought his complete set of professional tools. What made the Weatherby case significant was not just their wealth. Charles had converted most of his remaining assets into gold coins and jewelry hidden in a specially constructed wagon compartment. But their intelligence and natural suspicion. Charles had been a military officer, trained to notice details and assess threats. Margaret was an educated woman who had read extensively about trail dangers and was naturally cautious about trusting strangers. When the Weatherby wagon developed wheel problems near the chapel, Charles initially resisted the Graysons' offers of assistance. He had heard stories about travelers who accepted help from strangers and never been seen again, and something about the isolated location and the convenient timing of Brother Ezekiel's appearance made him uneasy. "I appreciate your Christian charity," Charles told Father Morai during their first meeting, "but we've got the skills and tools to handle our own repairs. We'll be moving on directly." The Father Morai, however, had become expert at reading people and adapting his approach accordingly. Rather than pressing the issue, he withdrew gracefully, mentioning casually that Sister Constance had observed signs of sickness in the area, possibly cholera or dysentery, and suggesting that the family might want to consider staying until they were certain none of them had been exposed. "Of course, Brother Charles," Morai said with apparent understanding. "A wise man protects his family, but I would feel remiss in my Christian duty if I didn't mention that Sister Constance has been treating several cases of trail fever in recent weeks. The symptoms can take time to manifest, and traveling while infected can spread disease and weaken the body's defenses. The mention of disease had exactly the effect Marai intended. Margaret Weatherby, already exhausted from months of trail life and worried about her daughter's health, began to reconsider their quick departure. When young David developed a mild fever the next day, a fever Sister Constance claimed was an early symptom of the regional sickness. The family's resistance crumbled. Perhaps, Margaret suggested to her husband, we should accept their offer of shelter just until we're certain David isn't seriously ill. Charles agreed reluctantly, but his military training made him maintain a level of alertness that posed a challenge for the Graysons. Unlike their previous victims, who had been desperate and grateful, Charles watched everything with calculating eyes and asked pointed questions about the family's background and the fate of other travelers who had sought their help. The Graysons adapted by providing him with carefully crafted stories about their successful treatment of previous families. They showed him the chapel cemetery, pointing out graves they claimed belonged to travelers who had arrived already dying and received proper Christian burial. They even introduced him to testimonial letters, forged documents supposedly written by grateful families who had recovered from serious illnesses and continued safely to their destinations. Brother Charles, Father Marai said one evening as they sat on the chapel porch, I understand your caution. A man who has served his country learns to trust carefully. But consider this, if we meant you harm, would we not have acted by now? Would we not choose easier targets than a trained soldier with weapons and watchful eyes? The psychological manipulation was subtle but effective. By acknowledging Charles's suspicions and military background, Marai made him feel respected and intelligent. By pointing out that he would be a difficult target, the preacher made the idea of being targeted seem less likely. Most importantly, by demonstrating apparent openness and honesty, he gradually lowered Charles's defenses. The actual murders of the Weatherby family took nearly 6 weeks to complete, representing the longest timeline the Graysons had yet attempted. Sister Constance began with extremely small arsenic doses administered through water. She claimed had been blessed for healing and recommended for preventing disease spread. The doses were so small that symptoms developed very gradually, appearing to be natural illness rather than poisoning. David, the youngest and physically weakest family member, succumbed first. His death seemed to confirm Sister Constance's warnings about regional sickness, and the family's gratitude for her care during his final days made them even more trusting of her medical knowledge. Margaret was next, developing symptoms Sister Constance attributed to the strain of nursing David through his illness. Charles, trained to analyze battlefield situations, began to notice patterns that disturbed him. The fact that he and his daughters remained healthy while others grew sick, the peculiar nature of the symptoms, and the Graysons' consistent presence during the worst moments of each family member's illness all contributed to growing unease. His suspicions reached a crisis point when he discovered Brother Ezekiel examining the contents of his wagon late one night. When confronted, Ezekiel claimed he had been checking to ensure their possessions were secure and wild animals hadn't gotten into their supplies. The explanation was plausible, but Charles's instincts told him otherwise. Margaret, he said to his dying wife the next morning, I think we need to leave this place. Something isn't right here. But Margaret was too weak to travel, and moving her would likely have killed her. Charles found himself trapped between growing suspicions and love for his family. He couldn't abandon his dying wife, but he couldn't shake the feeling that staying would doom them all. The resolution came when Charles made a discovery confirming his worst fears. While searching for medical supplies in the chapel basement, he stumbled upon a hidden compartment containing possessions clearly belonging to other travelers. Items too personal and valuable to have been willingly abandoned by their owners. Among the hidden possessions, he found a child's doll showing recent ownership signs, a pocket watch engraved with an unrecognized name, and most damning of all, a letter addressed to someone in Oregon City bearing a recent date, but obviously never sent. The letter, written in a woman's handwriting, described arriving safely at a chapel and thanking God for the kindness of the Christian family caring for her sick children. Charles realized he had discovered evidence of previous murders and that his family was being systematically poisoned by the very people who claimed to be saving them. But his realization came too late. Margaret died that night, and he awoke the next morning feeling the familiar symptoms that had preceded each family member's death. What Charles didn't know was that the Graysons had been watching him carefully, had noticed his growing suspicions, and had decided to accelerate his poisoning before he could act on his concerns. Father Murray had slipped a massive arsenic dose into Charles's evening meal, ensuring the former soldier would be too weak to pose a threat. As Charles lay dying, his twin daughters at his bedside, he made a desperate attempt to warn them about the Graysons' true nature. But his words were dismissed as the ramblings of a fevered mind, and the girls continued to trust the people slowly murdering them. The Weatherby case taught the Graysons several important lessons. First, intelligent, suspicious victims required more sophisticated manipulation techniques. Second, extending the murder timeline, while riskier, actually made their crimes more believable and profitable. Third, they needed better methods for detecting and managing victims who became suspicious of their activities. Most importantly, the case demonstrated that even trained, intelligent people could be successfully deceived and murdered if the right psychological techniques were applied with sufficient patience and skill. This realization gave the Graysons confidence to target increasingly wealthy and prominent families, knowing their methods could overcome even the most careful and suspicious travelers. The discovery of evidence from previous murders in the chapel basement also led to improvements in their evidence disposal procedures. They began burning personal items that could identify victims, melting down jewelry and precious metals to eliminate identifying marks, and creating more sophisticated hiding places for possessions they intended to keep or sell later. By the end of 1854, the Graysons had murdered 23 people in 7 families, and their operation had become a sophisticated criminal enterprise generating substantial profits while maintaining complete secrecy. They had also begun to see themselves not as criminals, but as instruments of divine will who were rewarded for their service by being allowed to prosper from their victims' possessions. The year 1855 marked a crucial turning point in the Graysons' murderous career, when they encountered their first major challenge: the survival of an intended victim who had witnessed enough to expose their entire operation. The incident began routinely enough with the arrival of the Patterson family from Ohio, but it would end with the Graysons facing the terrifying possibility of discovery and the need to make desperate choices about their future. Thomas Patterson was a successful merchant who had liquidated his Ohio business to pursue opportunities in Oregon's growing economy. He traveled with his wife Emily, their 4 children aged 8 to 16, and Emily's sister Catherine, an unmarried woman in her 30s, who served as the family's teacher and caregiver. What made the Patterson family particularly attractive to the Graysons was not just their obvious wealth. Thomas had converted his business assets into easily transportable gold and banknotes, but also their apparent respectability and the likelihood of a noticed appearance would eventually be noticed by business associates in both Ohio and in Oregon. The family's wagon train had dispersed near the Blue Mountains, and they were traveling alone when they encountered Brother Ezekiel approximately 5 miles from the Sacred Heart Chapel. Their wagon had not broken down, and none of the family members were obviously ill, but Ezekiel had learned to create opportunities rather than simply wait for them to occur. "Good afternoon, brother," Ezekiel called out as he approached the Patterson wagon. "I couldn't help but notice your fine team of oxen. That's quality livestock right there. You folks wouldn't happen to be interested in trading for some fresh supplies, would you? We keep a good stock at the chapel just ahead." Thomas Patterson was a shrewd businessman who had learned to evaluate offers carefully before making decisions. He was interested in the possibility of obtaining fresh supplies, but something about Ezekiel's manner, perhaps too friendly, too eager, made him cautious. "We appreciate the offer," Thomas replied, "but we're well supplied for the remainder of our journey. We'll be moving on directly." Ezekiel, however, had prepared for this response. Of course. But I wonder if I might mention something that could save your family considerable trouble. Sister Constance. That's our medical woman. She's been treating several cases of mountain fever in recent weeks. Nasty business that takes hold gradually, and by the time folks realize they're sick, they're too weak to travel safely. The mention of disease had its intended effect on Emily Patterson, who immediately began worrying about her children's health. "Mountain fever?" she asked. "We haven't heard anything about disease in the area." "Well, ma'am," Ezekiel said with practiced concern, "it's not something folks like to talk about. Bad for business, if you know what I mean. But Sister Constance, she's got remedies that can prevent it if administered before symptoms appear. Might be worth your while to stop by the chapel just to have your family examined." Thomas remained skeptical, but Emily's maternal instincts had been activated. The idea that her children might be exposed to dangerous disease without her knowledge was terrifying, and the possibility of prevention was too valuable to ignore. "Thomas," she said quietly, "perhaps we should at least speak with this medical woman. If there's disease in the area, shouldn't we take precautions?" Reluctantly, Thomas agreed to visit the chapel, telling himself they would simply get information about the supposed disease and then continue their journey. He had no way of knowing that this decision would lead to the most harrowing experience of his life and the near destruction of his entire family. The Graysons received the Patterson family with their usual combination of Christian warmth and subtle manipulation. Father Morai impressed Thomas with his knowledge of business and apparent familiarity with commercial conditions in Oregon. Sister Constance charmed Emily with her gentle manner and obvious affection for children. Brother Ezekiel entertained the Patterson children with frontier life stories and demonstrations of his various practical skills. Within hours of their arrival, the family had agreed to spend the night at the chapel to allow Sister Constance to examine everyone for signs of mountain fever. The examination revealed predictably that several family members showed early symptoms requiring immediate treatment with Sister Constance's preventive remedies. Catherine Patterson, Emily's sister, was the first to receive treatment. As an unmarried woman with no children of her own, she had devoted her life to caring for her sister's family and was particularly concerned about the children's health. She eagerly accepted Sister Constance's medicine and encouraged others to do the same. But Catherine was also the most observant family member, possessing a naturally analytical mind that made her notice details others might miss. On the second night of their stay, She observed Brother Ezekiel making what appeared to be a careful inventory of their wagon's contents. When she mentioned this to Sister Constance, the older woman dismissed it as routine concern for their security. Brother Ezekiel checks all our guests' possessions. Sister Constance explained. We've had problems with theft in the past, and we want to ensure nothing goes missing while families are under our care. The explanation seemed reasonable, but Catherine continued to notice small, troubling details. The way Father Morai's eyes lingered on Thomas's gold watch, the fact that Sister Constance always prepared her medicines in private, never allowing observation, and the peculiar coincidence that every family member receiving treatment seemed to develop symptoms, requiring additional treatment. Catherine's suspicions reached a critical point on the fourth day when she discovered Sister Constance adding a white powder to the medicine intended for young Timothy Patterson, the family's youngest child. When Catherine asked about the powder, Sister Constance claimed it was blessed salt enhancing the healing properties of the herbs. But Catherine had grown up in Ohio, where her father had been a pharmacist, and she recognized the crystalline appearance of the powder as inconsistent with ordinary salt. More importantly, she noticed that Sister Constance became nervous and defensive when questioned about her methods. Quite different from the serene confidence she usually displayed. That evening, Catherine made a decision that would save her life and the lives of her surviving family members. Instead of taking her prescribed medicine, she pretended to drink it, while actually spitting it into a handkerchief. She also managed to convince young Timothy to do the same, telling him it was a game they could play together. The results were dramatic and terrifying. While Thomas, Emily, and the three older children continued to weaken from their treatments, Catherine and Timothy remained healthy. More importantly, Catherine began to notice that the sickest family members were those most compliant with Sister Constance's medical regimen. By the sixth day, 2 Patterson children had died, and Thomas was clearly dying. Emily, though weak, was still conscious and alert enough for conversation with her sister. It was during this conversation that Catherine made the decision to share her suspicions. "Emily," she whispered, "I think these people are poisoning us. I think they're killing our family." Emily's initial reaction was disbelief and anger. The idea that the kind Christian family caring for them could be murderers seemed impossible. But as Catherine explained her observations and the pattern of symptoms, Emily began to see the horrible truth. "What can we do?" Emily asked. "Thomas is dying, the children are dying, and we're too weak to travel." Catherine had been preparing for this question. "We have to get away from here, even if it kills us. Staying here will definitely kill us, and we have to take Timothy. He's the only other one who hasn't been taking the medicine." The escape plan Catherine devised was desperate and dangerous, but it represented their only chance for survival. She waited until the early morning hours, when the Graysons were asleep, then helped Emily and Timothy slip out of the cabin. Thomas was too weak to move, and the older children were unconscious, but Catherine made the agonizing decision to leave them behind rather than risk the lives of those who might still be saved. The 3 survivors made their way to the family wagon where Catherine had hidden some gold and essential supplies. But as they prepared to leave, they heard footsteps approaching from the chapel. Father Morai, apparently alerted by some sound, was coming to investigate. "Quick," Catherine whispered. "Hide in the wagon bed under the canvas. Don't make a sound no matter what happens." Father Morai found Catherine standing beside the wagon, and his reaction confirmed her worst fears. Instead of showing concern for a family member who might be sleepwalking or confused by illness, His expression was cold and calculating. "Sister Catherine," he said quietly, "you should be resting. The mountain fever can cause confusion and poor judgment." "I couldn't sleep," Catherine replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was worried about Thomas and the children." Morai studied her for a long moment, and Catherine realized he was evaluating whether she had discovered their secret. The tension stretched between them like taut wire, each waiting for the other to reveal intentions. "Perhaps," Morai said finally, "Sister Constance should prepare a stronger remedy for you, something to help you rest more peacefully." Catherine understood he was proposing to kill her immediately rather than wait for gradual poisoning to take effect. "That's very thoughtful," she said, "but I think I'll try to sleep naturally first. I'm afraid I must insist," Morai replied, and his hand moved to something concealed beneath his coat. What happened next would haunt Catherine Patterson for the rest of her life. As Morai stepped toward her, apparently intending to force her back to the cabin, Emily Patterson emerged from behind the wagon. Despite weakness from poison, she had managed to arm herself with Thomas's pistol. "Step away from my sister," Emily said, her voice weak but determined. Morai turned toward this new threat, and in that moment of distraction, Catherine grabbed a heavy iron tool from the wagon and struck him in the head. The blow wasn't fatal, but it stunned him long enough for the two women and the child to begin their desperate escape. The wagon pulled away from the Sacred Heart Chapel, just as Brother Ezekiel emerged from the main building, alerted by the commotion. The last thing Catherine saw as they fled was Ezekiel running toward the cabin, where the rest of their family lay dying, probably to finish what poison had started. The escape journey was a nightmare of fear, exhaustion, and grief. Emily, weakened by weeks of poisoning, could barely remain conscious, leaving Catherine to drive the wagon while caring for Timothy and watching for pursuit. They had no clear idea where they were going, only desperate knowledge that they had to reach help before the Graysons could catch them, or poison could claim Emily's life. For 3 days they traveled through unfamiliar territory, following what appeared to be old hunting trails and hoping to encounter other travelers or settlements. Timothy, traumatized by family loss and terrifying escape, barely spoke. Emily drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for her dead children and husband. On the 4th day, they encountered a military patrol from Fort Dallas, soldiers investigating reports of Indian activity in the area. Catherine's story of murder and poisoning at the Sacred Heart Chapel was so extraordinary that the patrol leader initially assumed she was delirious from illness or trauma. But Catherine had brought evidence. A vial of Sister Constance's medicine she had saved, samples of the white powder she had seen added to treatments, and several items from their wagon she had observed Brother Ezekiel examining suspiciously. Most importantly, she had Emily as a witness, and although Emily was barely coherent, her symptoms were consistent with arsenic poisoning. The military investigation that followed would expose the true scope of the Graysons' crimes, but it would also reveal that the 3 family members had escaped just in time. When soldiers arrived at the Sacred Heart Chapel, they found Thomas Patterson and his 3 older children dead, their bodies showing clear arsenic poisoning signs. The Graysons themselves had vanished, taking most of the stolen possessions hidden in the chapel basement. The discovery of the basement storage areas provided investigators with their first glimpse into the systematic nature of the Graysons' murders. Hidden compartments contained possessions from dozens of families, carefully sorted and cataloged. Most shocking of all were the detailed records Father Morai had kept, documenting each family's murder with the cold precision of a business ledger. The records revealed that the Patterson family had been the Graysons' 37th intended victim group, and that over less than 3 years. They had murdered more than 150 people. The entries described not just the murders themselves, but also the profits realized from selling stolen goods and the lessons learned from each successful operation. Catherine Patterson's survival and testimony marked the beginning of the end for the Grayson family enterprise, but it would take years for authorities to fully understand their crime's scope and track down the perpetrators. Meanwhile, knowledge that such evil could hide behind a facade of Christian charity sent shockwaves through trail communities and fundamentally changed how travelers approached strangers offering help. The psychological impact on the 3 survivors was devastating and permanent. Emily Patterson never fully recovered from arsenic poisoning and died within a year of their escape. Her body, too damaged by toxic treatments to sustain life. Timothy grew to adulthood bearing childhood trauma scars, never able to trust religious authorities, and plagued by nightmares about the chapel and his family members' deaths. Catherine Patterson became obsessed with exposing the Graysons and ensuring they faced justice for their crimes. She provided testimony to military investigators, territorial authorities, and eventually federal marshals, becoming the primary witness whose survival made prosecution possible. Her detailed recollections of the family's methodology and the contents of their secret records would prove crucial in understanding their criminal enterprise's full extent. But the Graysons had not been idle during their escape from the Sacred Heart Chapel. With years of experience covering their tracks and substantial financial resources accumulated from victims, they had prepared for discovery possibility and developed contingency plans for continuing operations in new locations. The manhunt for the Grayson family began in earnest in fall 1855, but the fugitives had several crucial advantages, allowing them to evade capture for nearly 2 years. They possessed detailed knowledge of remote areas throughout Oregon Territory, substantial financial resources from years of murder and theft, and most importantly, the ability to create new identities and establish themselves in communities where their past was unknown. Federal Marshal William Harris, assigned to lead the investigation, faced challenges unlike any he had previously encountered. The Graysons were not ordinary criminals who committed single crimes and fled. They were organized killers who had operated successfully for years by exploiting victim trust and vulnerability. Their religious facade had been so convincing that many people who encountered them refused to believe they were capable of murder. These aren't desperate men who killed in passion moments, Marshal Harris wrote in his official report. These are calculating predators who turned murder into a business enterprise. They understand how to manipulate people's faith and charity for evil purposes, and they have the resources and intelligence to reinvent themselves whenever necessary. The investigation breakthrough came in spring 1857, when California authorities reported suspicious activities at a remote mission station near the Oregon-California border. The mission of divine mercy had appeared suddenly in a location providing access to multiple wagon train routes, and travelers stopping there for help were reportedly disappearing under mysterious circumstances. The mission was operated by a man calling himself Father Benedict Morrison and his 2 assistants, Sister Mary Morrison and Brother Thomas Morrison. To casual observers, they appeared to be a dedicated religious family providing charitable services to travelers in need. But Marshal Harris recognized the operational pattern from Catherine Patterson's testimony and evidence found at the Sacred Heart Chapel. The mission's location was strategically chosen to intercept families traveling between Oregon and California. Groups often isolated, exhausted, and vulnerable to assistance offers. The building itself was larger than the original chapel, with expanded basement areas and multiple outbuildings serving various purposes in a murder and theft operation. Most significantly, local authorities in Northern California had received reports of missing families matching the Graysons' preferred victim profile. Wealthy families traveling alone or in small groups would seek help at the mission, and then simply vanish, leaving no trace of planned destinations or current whereabouts. Marshal Harris assembled a team of federal agents and military personnel to investigate the mission, but he was determined not to repeat the mistake, allowing Grayson escape from the sacred Heart Chapel. This time the approach would be carefully planned and executed to prevent suspects from fleeing or destroying evidence. The investigation team spent several weeks conducting mission surveillance from concealed positions in surrounding hills. What they observed confirmed their worst suspicions. The Morrison family was indeed the Graysons, and they had not only resumed murderous activities, but had refined their methods based on previous experience. During the surveillance period, agents witnessed the Henderson family's arrival from Missouri, a prosperous farming family with 4 children traveling to California to establish a new homestead. The family's wagon was loaded with farming equipment, household goods, and what appeared to be substantial financial resources. The Graysons' approach to the Henderson family followed their established pattern with disturbing precision. Father Murray, now calling himself Father Benedict, greeted the family with apparent warmth and immediately began assessing their wealth and vulnerability. Sister Constance, using Sister Mary, quickly identified which family members might be most susceptible to medical treatment. Brother Ezekiel, now Brother Thomas, began evaluating their possessions and transportation. But the surveillance team also observed new elements in the Graysons' operation demonstrating how their methods had evolved. They had recruited several accomplices, local men posing as legitimate traders and scouts, who actually served as lookouts and assistants in the murder process. They had also developed more sophisticated techniques for disposing of bodies and concealing evidence. Most chillingly, agents observed the Graysons testing different approaches to family annihilation. Rather than relying solely on gradual arsenic poisoning, they experimented with faster acting methods, eliminating entire families within days rather than weeks. They had apparently concluded their previous timeline was too risky, and that quicker murders would be less likely to attract attention. Marshal Harris faced a terrible dilemma as he watched the Henderson family drawn into the Graysons' trap. Intervening immediately might save the Henderson family, but it would also allow the Graysons to escape again, potentially to resume activities elsewhere. Waiting for more evidence might provide proof needed for successful prosecution, but it would almost certainly result in innocent people's deaths. The decision was made for him when one of his agents observed Brother Ezekiel administering what appeared to be a large, poisoned dose to the youngest Henderson child. The boy, who had been healthy and active that morning, suddenly became violently ill after drinking milk Ezekiel had personally delivered. "We'll move now," Harris told his team. "We can't let another family die while we gather evidence." The raid on the mission of Divine Mercy began at dawn on June 15, 1857, nearly 2 years after the Graysons' escape from the Sacred Heart Chapel. Federal agents and military personnel surrounded the compound while the family slept, preventing any possibility of escape or evidence destruction. What they found inside the mission buildings exceeded even their worst expectations. The basement areas contained possessions from at least 20 families, far more than could have been accumulated during the Graysons' brief time at this location. hidden compartments revealed detailed records of murders, committed not just in Oregon and California, but also in other territories where the family had apparently operated before establishing their Oregon base. The records painted a picture of criminal enterprise spanning more than a decade and multiple states. The Graysons had been murdering travelers and stealing possessions since at least 1845, moving from location to location as circumstances required, and leaving behind a death trail investigators were only beginning to understand. Father Murray's journals contained entries revealing the psychological evolution of the family's criminal activities. Early entries showed some evidence of guilt and religious justification for their actions, with Murray convincing himself he was providing mercy to suffering travelers while being rewarded by God for charitable work. But later entries demonstrated complete abandonment of any moral considerations. Murders were described purely in terms of profit and efficiency, with detailed analysis of which methods produced best results and which victim types offered greatest rewards. The journals read like business records of a particularly successful enterprise, with human lives reduced to inventory items and murder treated as routine operational procedure. Most disturbing were entries describing the family's future plans. Murray had been developing schemes for expanding their operation to include multiple locations with different family members, running separate murder sites along various travel routes. He had also been experimenting with ways to kill larger groups simultaneously, apparently motivated by the inefficiency of murdering families one by one. The Henderson family's capture in early poisoning stages allowed investigators to save their lives and obtain first-hand testimony about the Graysons' methods. James Henderson, the family patriarch, provided detailed accounts of how the family had been manipulated and how the poisoning process had been disguised as medical treatment. They seemed like angels sent by God. Henderson told investigators, "Sister Mary was so gentle with our children, so knowledgeable about treating sickness." Father Benedict spoke with such authority about Scripture and God's will. If someone had told me they were murderers, I would have called them crazy. The psychological manipulation techniques the Graysons employed were sophisticated enough to deceive intelligent, educated people, specifically warned about trusting strangers on the trail. Their religious authority, combined with apparent medical knowledge and genuine charitable actions, created a facade nearly impossible to penetrate until too late. Sister Constance, when finally questioned by authorities, showed no remorse for her role in the murders. Instead, she expressed anger at being prevented from completing medical treatments and insisted families they killed were better off dead than continuing to suffer from trail diseases. Those people were dying anyway. She told Marshal Harris during interrogation, "We gave them comfort in their final days and ensured their possessions supported God's work rather than being wasted. We provided mercy they wouldn't have received otherwise." The brother Ezekiel maintained silence throughout interrogation, refusing to provide information about their activities or express any opinion about their crimes. His behavior suggested he viewed himself as a faithful follower simply obeying orders without questioning moral implications. Father Murray, however, displayed a completely different personality when confronted with evidence of his crimes. The charming, authoritative preacher disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating killer showing no emotion when presented with survivor testimony or evidence of victims' suffering. "You people don't understand what we accomplished," he told investigators. "We eliminated the weak and diseased. We redistributed wealth from those who couldn't protect it to those who could use it effectively. And we provided spiritual comfort to people who would have died horrible deaths anyway. We were instruments of natural selection and divine will. The scope of the Graysons' crimes continued to expand as investigators analyzed their records and connected them to unsolved disappearances throughout Western territories. Families that had vanished without explanation. Isolated graves discovered by later travelers, reports of mysterious illnesses at remote religious sites, all forming a pattern pointing to Grayson involvement. By investigation completion, authorities had connected the family to more than 800 people's murders across multiple states and territories. The actual number was likely higher, as many victims had been transient families whose disappearances were never officially reported or investigated. The Grayson family trial began in September 1857 and quickly became one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in American frontier history. The prosecution, led by Territorial Attorney General Samuel Morrison, faced the challenge of presenting evidence of carefully concealed crimes with victims no longer alive to testify. The key to prosecution's case was Father Morai's meticulous records throughout their criminal career. These journals provided detailed accounts of individual murders, methods used, possessions stolen, and profits realized, written in Morai's own handwriting and containing information only perpetrators could have known. The records served as confessions that could not be disputed or explained away. Catherine Patterson's testimony provided crucial context for understanding how murders were carried out and how the family deceived victims so effectively. Her survival story demonstrated both the systematic nature of Grayson methods and the psychological manipulation techniques they employed to maintain control over victims. The Henderson family's testimony showed the Graysons had continued and refined murderous activities, even after escaping the Sacred Heart Chapel. Their account of attempted murders at the Mission of Divine Mercy proved the family had learned from previous mistakes and developed even more efficient methods for killing entire families quickly. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was physical evidence found at both the Sacred Heart Chapel and the Mission of Divine Mercy. Investigators had discovered not just murdered families' possessions, but also tools and supplies used in the poisoning process, detailed maps showing unmarked grave locations, and correspondence with black market dealers who had purchased stolen goods. The defense attorneys attempted to argue the family had provided legitimate medical care to sick travelers and deaths had been caused by diseases contracted during trail travel rather than deliberate poisoning. They suggested possession of other families' belongings could be explained by legitimate purchases or inheritance from grateful patients who died despite care. But the prosecution demonstrated that death patterns at locations operated by the Graysons were statistically impossible, unless deliberate murder was involved. Expert medical testimony confirmed survivors' described symptoms were consistent with arsenic poisoning rather than natural trail diseases. Most importantly, the family's own records clearly described their activities as murder committed for profit rather than medical treatment provided for charitable purposes. The trial lasted 6 weeks and attracted national attention as newspapers across the country reported on systematic trail family murder by people posing as Christian missionaries. The case highlighted westward migrants' vulnerability and the ease with which predators could exploit trust and desperation of families seeking help in isolated areas. Father Morai Grayson was convicted on multiple murder charges and sentenced to death by hanging. Sister Constance Grayson was also convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, making her one of the first women in American frontier history to receive such a severe sentence for criminal activity. Brother Ezekiel Grayson was convicted as accessory to murder and sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison. The executions and imprisonment of the Grayson family marked the end of one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in American frontier history. But their crimes' impact extended far beyond immediate victims and families. The case fundamentally changed how travelers approached help offers from strangers and led to increased military patrols along major travel routes. Religious communities throughout frontier territories were forced to confront the reality that faith and charitable instincts could be exploited by predators, understanding how to manipulate Christian charity for evil purposes. Many legitimate missionaries and religious workers found their efforts to help travelers met with suspicion and fear as people struggled to distinguish between genuine charitable work and potential criminal activity. The Graysons' crimes also exposed significant weaknesses in frontier law enforcement and communication systems. The family had operated more than a decade without detection, partly because no effective way existed for authorities in different territories to share information about suspicious activities or missing persons. The case led to improvements in interterritorial communication and more systematic approaches to investigating missing persons reports. Catherine Patterson, the survivor whose testimony had been crucial to prosecution, never fully recovered from her traumatic experience with the Grayson family. She spent her remaining years advocating for improved traveler protection and working with law enforcement agencies to identify and investigate suspicious activities at remote religious sites. Her nephew Timothy, the young boy who survived the family's attempted murder, grew to adulthood bearing psychological scars, affecting his entire life. He never married, never had children, and spent adult years as a frontier guide, helping other families avoid dangers that had destroyed his own. The physical locations where the Graysons had operated were abandoned and eventually destroyed by local communities wanting to eliminate all traces of horrible crimes committed there. The Sacred Heart Chapel was burned to the ground in 1858, and the Mission of Divine Mercy was dismantled with its materials used for other construction projects. But the psychological impact of the Graysons' crimes lingered for generations. Families throughout Western territories told stories about false missionaries who murdered hundreds of innocent people, using these tales as warnings about trusting strangers offering help on isolated trails. The case also raised disturbing questions about evil's nature and ordinary people's capacity to commit extraordinary crimes. Father Morai, Sister Constance, and Brother Ezekiel had not been obviously deranged or visibly dangerous individuals. They had been intelligent, articulate people who successfully posed as charitable Christians for more than a decade. Their ability to maintain their facade while systematically murdering innocent families challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and religious authority reliability. The case demonstrated that evil could be methodical, organized, and sustained over long periods by people appearing as community pillars. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that the Graysons genuinely believed their actions justified and had convinced themselves they performed a service by eliminating weak and diseased travelers while redistributing possessions to more deserving recipients. Their self-righteousness and lack of remorse suggested a form of moral corruption far more dangerous than simple greed or desperation. The legacy of the Grayson family murders serves as a reminder that the American frontier was shaped not just by honest pioneers' courage and determination, but also by predators seeking to exploit their vulnerability and trust. The 800 people who died at the hands of false missionaries represent a dark chapter in westward expansion's story, a chapter revealing the full range of human capacity for both good and evil. Their story stands as a testament to vigilance importance, blind trust dangers, and the terrible price innocent people can pay when evil disguises itself as righteousness. In the end, the Graysons' crimes remind us that the most dangerous predators are often those understanding exactly how to exploit our noblest instincts for their own malevolent purposes. Today, more than a century and a half after the Graysons met their justice, their story continues to haunt the American West's collective memory. The families they destroyed, the trust they betrayed, and the lives they cut short serve as permanent reminders that evil can flourish anywhere human vulnerability and desperation create exploitation opportunities. The courage of survivors like Catherine Patterson, who risked everything to expose truth and seek justice for the dead, provides a counterpoint to the Graysons' legacy darkness. Her testimony not only brought killers to justice, but also saved countless future lives by alerting authorities and the public to dangers posed by predators using religious authority to mask criminal activities. In remembering the Grayson family's crimes, we honor not just victims who died, but also survivors who found strength to fight against evil and ensure justice was finally served. Their story reminds us that, even in humanity's darkest moments, there are always those who will stand up for truth and refuse to let evil triumph unchallenged. What do you think about this chilling tale from America's frontier past? Does it change how you view the romanticized stories of westward expansion, the Grayson family's systematic exploitation of Christian charity, reveals human nature's darkest aspects and the terrible price of misplaced trust? If this story has given you chills and made you think about hidden dangers lurking on frontier trails, share it with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support content bringing these forgotten horrors to light, and subscribe so you never miss the disturbing truths shaping America's past. The next time you hear stories about brave pioneers conquering the American West, remember they also had to survive predators like the Graysons, people who turned murder into a family business and hid their evil behind religious devotion masks.